Hey Emily, how are you?
Hello, Luca. Nice to meet you. I'm good.
And you, it's good to see you. I really appreciate you coming on. So thanks for making the time. So I appreciate it.
Yes. Yes, thank you. And thanks for being flexible. I got to hang out with my daughter's school today, so that was lovely.
That's no problems at all. I'm glad that you could go this morning. It's always good when I get the chat to someone in the US because we got that give or take time in between. So it ends up usually working out pretty well. So it's a win-win.
Exactly, exactly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you really well, and I hope
Perfect.
everything's at your end as well.
Yes, yes, all good over here.
Good, I'm glad. Well, I was very interested because when I come across you, I actually come across you through a podcasting website whereby the guests are shared on there and how you can get in touch with them. And
Yes,
when I first came across, I was like a screen time consultant who seems to specialize and have a vision towards how the contemporary forms of the issues that I'm seeing right now are going to portray what they're giving out right now, as well as what the future's looking like. So, really interesting background.
yes, thank you. It is a unique position to be in, and I'm always grateful to talk to anybody who was willing to listen.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to listen. I've listened to a few of your episodes so far, and been
Great.
listening to quite a few of your tech intentional tips, which are really insightful. So, and especially when you touch upon some of the topic areas which are going to come up throughout, because there's a lot whereby, as a student myself, as a teacher myself, as a coach, these different hats that I wear, there's a lot of combination towards of what you talk about that comes across each of them from a different perspective, but it's so important.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, that was my goal is like, this is a topic that touches so many areas of our lives that it can be applied in different ways, but be relevant for all of us. So, yeah, that's great.
Absolutely, for sure. And for me, part of it, obviously being on the sport podcast, which usually talks about, soccer and all those sort of components, it's like how would someone might look at this or listen to this or might come across it scrolling through the podcast episodes or something, and they might look at it and go, what does a screen time consultant have to do with sport? Well, actually, there's quite a lot. We can build in a perspective towards that, towards, whether it's resilience and skills that kids are lacking, why they're lacking these sort of things, what the barriers may be, is participation dropping, is the interest, how this looks on the future. So it's not just looking at it from a sport perspective, it's actually looking at the individual and then how that
Yes.
could apply towards this different landscape of someone who might be listening to give a different perspective to something that is so important right now.
Yes, absolutely. And, again, like there's so many layers to it, right? It's the children themselves and what they're using. I imagine there's the parents and fans using devices while they're watching or filming. There's the coaches that might use platforms to communicate with players. Like there's all different layers here. And again, I think I take a very, what I call tech intentional or a non judgmental approach to this because, when we know better, we do better and it's better for everyone. So that's my goal.
I completely agree, and I'm glad that we share the same outlook towards that because even though you're a screen time consultant right now and you have a great concept in terms of what the contemporary issues are, you're also an author, a visionary as such, but you also come from an educational background as a teacher within yourself. So I'm not sure if you
Yes.
want to give more of a firm background introduction to yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So I spent 12 years teaching middle school English, which here in the States is around 12 and 13-year-olds. Not everyone's favorite age group, but I loved it. And I spent about 7, 8 years full time in the classroom. And then I went part time and taught like a media literacy program, sort of an anti bullying program that was sort of folded into the regular curriculum. And I had the privilege of being in the classroom through a 12-year window that started in 2003 and ended in 2015, which really captured both the end of a no phone experience for children and the beginning of everyone having a phone. So just in over a decade, I witnessed this huge change. And at the same time, I actually also witnessed a huge change as a teacher in terms of what I was being asked to do, where I put my grades, where I uploaded assignments. I mean, before it was all paper based, right? And now I was being asked as a teacher to move digital. So it was sort of two big issues happening simultaneously. And I always like to point that out because I think you can't separate them. They're intertwined in many ways. And so initially I'd started speaking with my students about like, hey, you guys are on your phones, and or actually it was before phones, actually it was social media. They were on MySpace and Facebook, if, back in the day. And they were talking about stuff that was happening online, and people getting left out and being mean. And I was doing the adult thing of like, well, how you appear online, you want to be that way in real life, and you can, a little bit preachy probably. And it was actually an aha moment for me when my students were like, yeah, but our parents are scrolling through Facebook, our parents are texting and driving. And I sort of had this like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't a kid problem. This is an adult problem that's affecting children. And I can talk to students about it, but I also need to be talking to the parents. And so that kind of was where I made this pivot from being in the classroom to working more directly with parents. But I love working with kids too. So I do some student workshops as well when I speak at schools, but I feel like parents are kind of on the front lines of this.
And absolutely, they're on the front line, and there's a lot where you can talk about in terms of teaching experience, how that comes across, and how that
Yes.
evolution over time for yourself as well as a student comes into perspective. Because, as you say there, when you're asked to move your grades online, and how your teaching might move, it's the same with university. So typically, when you might see university in a film, it's handing in papers, then the papers get handed
Yes.
back out at the end of class. And then I was thinking about that when I was in a lecture the other day myself. And a lot of it is whereby the lecturers are now scrolling through hundreds of papers through a screen all day long, and they're
Yes.
giving feedback through, a functional a platform whereby it's very, it's not person centered as such. It's more of this is the feedback on the screen. But even for them, their lifestyles have changed, and therefore the teaching perspective
Yes.
has changed. So that landscape of how it's going to look in the future is going to be so interesting for us as educators, and how
Yes.
different our roles will look in the next 10 years, for example, and the importance of adjusting to technology, but also trying to have a framework which is beneficial in that approach to understanding its benefits and how to be healthy with it as well.
Yes, I agree. And I often say I'm not anti-tech, I'm tech intentional. And, excuse me, I believe there is a role for technology in education. I know there's some incredible, I mean, look, we get to talk across the world to each other like this. It's amazing. And I really feel strongly about protecting childhood, about prioritizing skill development before we deploy screens as a tool. I think again, when we offer them too soon, too much, too dependent on them, we really displace opportunities for children to have real world experiences. And that's what I am seeing increasingly. Technology used to be like we would have one computer lab a week in elementary school. Now we have, kindergartners and first graders coming home with iPads for school. And that is fundamentally changing childhood. I mean, I think it does concern me that that's it. I was just volunteering at my daughter's school this morning. She's almost 13, and I was speaking to the counselor, the sixth grade counselor, and he was saying, we're not equipped for paper and pencil. Like the funding isn't there for it. And it is mind-boggling to me as a former educator that like to request paper and pencil in school now is considered a revolutionary act, a rebellious request. And like that, what? I mean, it's just crazy to me because there's so much. It's not just, force a kid to write on a piece of paper. There are so many skills that go into that, from the hand-eye coordination, the brain development, the pacing, your attention and focus. Like it's not just write it down. It's so much more than that. So, I am old school in that sense. I think it's both and, right? And it can't be at the expense of what we know is good, what we know is sound evidence-based learning and development.
I'm completely there with you, and there's quite a lot within that to unpack because even the other day I was watching a reel, and it was when it was sort of like a joking reel, sort of as such. So it's like when two teachers book a computer lab out for their class, and they booked it at the same time, and you see a clash between them. And I was like, do you know what? You actually don't see teachers booking out computer labs anymore because there's so
Yeah.
many Chromebooks or iPads available for the lesson. They don't even need to leave their classrooms or even book out a class. So the amount of classes
Exactly.
we used to book out a computer room, I don't even see that anymore. So it didn't
Yeah.
dawn on me to me until I even watched that reel the other day and I come into it. So it's even that change as well. But
Yes.
doing a history lesson with my students yesterday, and we were talking about World War One, and we were listening to a prime minister in Britain and a letter that he wrote to his partner at the time, and they read out what the letter was, and even the writing and the type of language in that isn't language that we even consume these days. And for
Yeah.
a comparison of a student in terms of their writing to what it was, I think that art of writing has been lost. So that
Yes.
balance and some people might argue, oh, you're not adapting, computers are there and this and that. Well, actually, we're lacking quite a lot of creative skills. We're missing out on students being able to read fluently. We're missing out on their vocabulary expanding and developing because they're not going to write letters the way they once did. And yes, okay, some of the world has changed and some of the language might be very different, but it's actually the context and the information which they struggle to consume, struggle to understand, and then they can't put into context themselves because they're not applying paper and pen or they're not reading. And when I say to
Yes.
students, oh, just grab a book, maybe sit down for half an hour, why would I want to do that, sir? It's so boring. And I'm like,
Yes.
okay, it might seem boring,
Yes.
but are you reading the right books, etc., etc.?
Well, and books don't have algorithms. This is what an algorithm will push to you exactly what you're interested in. It's easy, it's convenient, you have to do nothing. There's no friction, there's no work or struggle. And what we know about learning and brains is that learning happens in moments of friction. And so struggling with a difficult text, even an old, I mean, even Shakespeare, even when I was growing up and we had to read Shakespeare, it was like, it was a struggle because it was unfamiliar, but we didn't not do it. And so part of the problem is by having this continual feed in our social media, our news, our games, which is designed to just sort of hook and hold our neural pathways, right? It just hits that dopamine spot. It's easy, it's breezy, it just comes and comes. Why would we choose a book? Book is much more challenging and laborious. And, it breaks my heart as a former English teacher, because that to me was so important. And there's something about the physical reading of a book. I used to make my students open their new books and smell them because there's nothing like the smell of a new book. And you can't smell a Kindle, you can't smell a laptop. It doesn't have the same tactile experience. And so, again, I always put a caveat on this that there are some children for whom a tech-based tool might be a learning like a support tool, like somebody with a learning disability or dysgraphia or dyslexia or nonverbal autism. Like that's the exception though. I always say, like, if one child in their class needs eyeglasses, you don't give all of the children eyeglasses. It's like we're doing this sort of, here's a whole bunch of tech and then expecting children to perform sort of in a standardized way when children are not standardized. That's not how it works. And so that's what concerns me a lot too, is that this shift towards, letting technologists dictate what education looks like and tell teachers who are the experts in teaching what teaching should look like. That's wrong. I won't walk into a courtroom and tell a lawyer how to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. So it bothers me a lot. And I have a lot of empathy for teachers who I think are stuck between what they're told to do and what they know is right and best for kids.
And I think it's you've got another industry changing the narrative for another industry and trying to change the perspective in terms of adapting to the way that they want them to adapt. And it can be very hard because then you're seen to be such as the pawn within, the big landscape of a chess piece. But actually,
Yes.
education should be the table, and everything else should move around that and how it fits in. And
Amen.
I think it's about approaching that and making sure that strategy is right in place for the organization and institution, and also for educators, not just to go, well, actually, I got 30 Chromebooks or 30 iPads available, we have to use them. Actually,
Yeah.
we're going to utilize maybe a few of them. We're going to do some group tasks. There's going to be some talking in there. There's going to be some problem solving, and we're going to get back to basics rather than, oh, here's some Chromebooks. And this is what I'm seeing a lot of lessons is a lot of Chromebooks are given out, and it's very easy to deliver that lesson then because it's a lot of independent learning, and you're able then to perhaps do all the other tasks you have, and there's nothing wrong with that at times. But when it becomes so much of a norm, and I'm looking at classes whereby I'm walking past them often, and they're every lesson they're on it,
Yes.
actually
Yes.
there's so many different skills which you're lacking, and I'm not seeing some of the core approaches to learning taking place because we've adapted, or we're taking easy way out by, oh, we'll book the Chromebooks out, we'll get these out for the lesson.
Amen. That's exactly it. And even I get I get very passionate about this because it makes me angry because you're absolutely right. Like, even again, I was just at my daughter's school this morning. There's 1,000 students in this school, and they have a phone-free school, which is the rule is no student is supposed to have a device, AirPods, Apple Watch, nothing from the beginning to the end of the day, which is great. As a parent, that makes my job easier. But they all have Chromebooks. So today I was helping out at a choir festival and the kids are singing, and there's some students sitting in the back of the auditorium and I can see them. I'm standing behind them. And a couple of these boys pull out their school computers and are playing a video game.
Mm.
I mean, so part of me is like, I get that they don't have the phone rule. That's wonderful. I think that's absolutely a must. But you're giving them another platform on which they're doing exactly the same thing. And one could argue, well, they were bored and they were sitting there and waiting. But that's not learning. That's not part of being bored is a learning opportunity too, right? Like, there's a muscle to build there with struggling through boredom. And I don't blame the school. Again, I feel like part of this has come from top down, district decision makers and technologists, or even state officials, and depending on the country, of course. But like, that the message is that more tech is better. That's the message. And the tech industry loves that message because it makes them a lot of money. And I just am not, when you look at an industry, which a lot of people are looking at this industry of education and technology as very lucrative. I mean, there is so much money to be made in it. And so, I even was just doing some online Googling and I was like, what is an industry I should invest in for the future? Like, just curious. Ed tech comes up number one because it's growing so fast and it is so profitable. But what makes me so angry is it's not the students who benefit from that. It isn't the teachers who are seeing the return on that investment, right? It's the technology companies. And so, you know, there are probably exceptions. I'm sure there's a few altruistic companies, but the problem is fundamentally the business model, right? It's they can't make money without their current practices, and so are they going to do it if they can't make money?
Mm.
I'm a cynic about that, I guess.
Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Everyone has to have their opinion and approach towards it, and the more that awareness is spread about that as well, I think, which is an important perspective, is that
Yeah,
narrative is important to understand that, and we shouldn't be controlled by that, or it shouldn't be pushed on us because it's profitable and beneficial to someone else, and not to
exactly.
to be detrimental towards someone else's education at the scope of the
Yeah,
benefits of an industry, for example. But I was reading your blog when it came to you and your daughter, and you said away for the day, and that is a nice term to sort of use as well, rather than a school-wide ban. Away for the day sounds like just put it away, and then we're going to approach that in
yeah,
a different way. And I think that
yeah,
sort of context and term which has been used really helps sort of bring a friendliness towards
yes.
a quite potentially strict approach towards a phone ban, for example, or trying to reduce the use of it.
Yes, and I one of the things I always want to make sure schools will say, "Oh, well, we have a phone away for the day policy," and then I will ask more questions, and they'll say, "Well, just during class time, during passing periods, the kids can have it, or during lunch they can have it." That's not an away for the day policy. That might be some restrictions, but away for the day means first bell until last bell. And the reality is, like, even today at my daughter's school, I definitely saw kids pulling phones out of their pockets. It is not 100% that kids are going to follow that rule. But the advantage of a school wide, or even better, a district wide rule is that that's the norm. It's just the expectation. And then you deal with the outliers. When there isn't clarity around what the rule is, or when it's left up to individual teachers, you get digital whack a mole, is what I call it. The arcade game where you're just constantly trying to stop and block and remove and punish and threaten and take away. And what a waste of energy and time. That an educator doesn't want to spend time doing that. They want to teach. That's why they're doing it. And so I think it's better for teachers that there's a school-wide policy. Absolutely. And it's better for kids. And yeah, kids are always going to break the rules, but that's pretty darn normal for children. So you deal with it in that context then, rather than just saying, oh, well, if you break it, so why have it? That's the part I get frustrated with.
I think you're making another important point there in terms of relating that back to the boredom piece of a child, and if they're bored, then they've got a problem to solve in terms of what to do.
Yes.
And when it comes to that, I'm sort of I was in my previous school where I went as a student, and I worked there as a member of staff before I came into my new school. And my new school are very big on lunchtime in terms of the canteen, of everything being in takeaway trays because it's convenient, it's quicker, there's no plates, etc. But on my
Yeah.
previous school, we were very big on collecting plates as you went up.
Uh,
You'd have it served to you, you sit down, you put your plate away. And when I spoke
oh,
to some of my students about that in my new school, they're like, "Sir, why would we even do that? It's so much easier just to throw away." I was like, "Actually, it teaches you a lot of lessons whereby you get it, your plate,
yeah.
you're responsible for it. You have to be independent in terms of choosing.
Yeah,
You have
there's
to
a
communicate with
skill.
team staff in terms of what you want for that day. You might have to overcome if they don't have the food that you want, what you decide. And it might be, very little, but there's actually quite a lot in that. And then there's the discussion when you sat down. So that piece of rather than just very
Yes.
quick grab a takeaway tray, throw it away, you move on, and then whatever your next activity is with your peer group, there should actually be a form of sitting down and having that communication where we're lacking a lot of that. And you can take that into home whereby you might not sit with mum and dad. You might, quickly grab your food, go and sit in front of the telly, or you might have YouTube
Yeah.
on your phone, and you should sit
Yeah.
down with them, even if it's for 10 minutes, and overcome what you might call social awkwardness because
Yes.
you're lacking those skills because you're not doing it in a
Exactly.
day-to-day routine.
Exactly. And that is, I think what is so hard for people who don't have experience, especially with like those early teenager years, is we get mixed up between what is normal child development and developmental stages and what is interfered with by technology. And so, being awkward as a 12-year-old is really normal. Like all of us probably could go back and think of memories from that age group that were painful and embarrassing. And we felt like, cringe, as the kids would say today. But normal. That is part of adolescence. It is actually incredibly important that we have those experiences because we learn how to deal with them. That doesn't mean they feel good, that maybe even it's terribly humiliating and traumatic, even at moments. But when we deny the opportunity to experience the wide range of human emotion, we are not growing as humans. We are not learning how to exist in a complex world. Because as complicated as the internet and digital media are, it's actually a very easy world. It's a very like comforting, familiar. You just get fed what you want. It's just, pudding and cake all day long, right? But that's not sustenance. That's not long term health. That's not relationship based. And I think that's a beautiful example of, yeah, it's more work to serve a meal, but what are the benefits of that? I mean, that is a no brainer to me if you're taking a tech intentional, child centered approach or even human centered. Let's be honest, it's good for the adults too. And so, kids are not standardized. We're schools are not cogs in a machine, even though obviously public education historically was to provide future workforce. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I really want to think about whether doing something easy is always the best decision, right? It might be more efficient. It might have a better ROI on your investment or whatever, but like it's not what's better for people. And that's kind of the trick here, right? That these are contradictory things.
And again, I'm with you there because part of my job is I work with a lot of our most challenging students. So when they don't have a great day in school, they tend to work with me. And as part of that is I could sit there and go, actually, I still get paid at the end of the day whether we do the work or not. And as much as I could go, right, all have Chromebooks, make my day very easy. I could have overcome your behavior. I don't have to deal with it. Actually, I sit there and I go, actually, I want to challenge this student because they're not used to working and writing out. They're not used to doing their maths because they're constantly out of their maths lessons. So I'm going to take that challenge on because I want the best for them. And I don't care whatever I face because it is going to be that a long-term benefit to them. And they might not see it in the moment, but actually they
Yeah.
know over time, the more that they come to me, they know, so the first thing we're going to do is maths every morning. Yes, it's maths every
That's
morning because it's a core subject. It's key to life.
yeah.
And it's not just looking at going, right, you're doing this because it's a subject in school. We're doing it because you have to develop those mental skills and you're also not in
Exactly.
those lessons. So it's for your own benefit. And whether I have to, spend an hour trying to coach them into doing their work, whether it's then trying to calm them down, we're going to get to that point where we're going to do the work rather than me going, there's some Chromebooks, sit there for a few hours, do your own thing, and then we'll see whether we can do the, the bare
Yeah.
minimum for us to have, a successful day
Yeah.
because it's for their own benefit, for the long-term vision of them rather than the easy way out.
Exactly. And that's, I mean, kudos to you for doing that because it is hard work and it does mean uncomfortable conversations and holding us to higher standards. But, when you think about like a memory of something you learned as a child, whether it was in school or out of school, always the learning moment came when you persevered through something challenging or tricky or confusing or hard. And that's literally what learning is is mastering something you've struggled with for a while and then moving to that next step. And this is where I see the technology in education is counter to that saying if we just give tech it'll make things easier. Well, for whom, first of all, and for what purpose? Because again, I'm going to argue that easier isn't better learning. And again, there are exceptions. There are times where maybe, showing a video online is a valuable way to do show a scientific concept. Great. But it's got to be the exception, not the rule. And if you put it on a kid's computer, I mean, ask any child, like, can you do X, Y, or Z on your school computer? And they're all going to say, oh yeah, I can get on YouTube. I can play video games. I can listen to Spotify during class. I mean, are we okay with this? Like, we know how bad adults are at self-regulating. Like, why on earth would we think kids aren't going to have trouble?
And it's true, because once they have that sort of scope and free time to do that or take advantage of it, they're going to repeatedly take that, and they're going to utilize an approach where, oh, I had a Chromebook last lesson, I want it again this lesson, or sir, let me do this across one faculty. Now I'm going to do this in the other faculty. Well, actually, what sir let you do might be a little bit of a different approach to what we're doing in this faculty. And hours are very limited in terms of Chromebook time. So therefore, you have to work very hard to have that time, whether we agree it's going to be a benefit to you and how you're going to approach that work. So for us, we tried to use a lot of Canva with the students, or I tried to get them to use Canva. And like, sir, what's Canva? And when they tried to utilize it, like, sir, this is quite difficult to use. Actually, it's really easy to use, and it's a bit different than your standard PowerPoint. So when you get when you're presenting things, you're going to look at doing it in very different ways. So could you utilize music in this way? Could you utilize your transitions? Therefore, we're developing those skills and how they utilize that presentation in a very different way. So we're trying to utilize it in the right way and have that balance, because it's that very healthy conversation that we're trying to have in terms of there is a benefit, but there is a balance, and you have to do your research behind it before you go off and present and try to build that bigger picture in, rather than being standardized across the board and going, do you know what, this is what we're all going to do. And I think, as you keep saying there, for that approach towards standardization, I think many years ago when I was in education, that was very much the core objective, was to get every student there. Now, over time, we're still adapting to that to try and move away from standardization, but also trying to overcome some of the barriers that we're seeing in terms of that, as well as what we might call differentiation. And as educators might argue, is, well, that's actually very detrimental rather than very beneficial. So there is always arguments towards it, but I think that balance is very important.
Yes, absolutely. And again, a good teacher will look at a Canva presentation as the end product, right? You don't start there. And part of the problem I see is we just go straight to the tech. And so, what does a child need to know about a presentation? Well, they need to know what makes something a good presentation. How do you get people's attention? How do you use research, like actual research, not just Googled research, to support your claims, right? Like, there are so many elements that go in. I mean, again, that's the building block part of learning. And I worked with a student about 10 years ago, and I mean, it's 10 years ago at this point, but the story is still always gets a jaw drop. And, she had, like you were mentioning in the beginning, she had everything on her iPad. She was 12, 11 years old. Everything for school was on an iPad. They were piloting a program, which, in hindsight, that's just what we all do now. But her books are online, her homework is online, everything. She had no textbooks, no notebooks in paper. So she has a science assignment. She opens up the book PDF. She's trying to find the chapter, hundreds of pages of a PDF. She's scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, can't find it, gets frustrated, cuts and pastes the question from the worksheet, which is digital in a different app, puts it into a Google search bar, cuts and pastes the first response. She doesn't even read it, pastes it into Notability, where she's supposed to write and turn in her homework. I'm sitting there going, oh, do you know what plagiarism is? And she's like, well, yeah, but my teacher doesn't read this anyway, which is a different problem, right? We're asking now teachers to spend more time online reading student assignments, which, grading 12-year-old essays is kind of a mind-numbing task, or it can be, but I'd much rather do it on paper than on a screen, right? So then I go, okay, well, could you at least take the answer and put it in your own words and write it out? And she goes, well, I don't know how to type. And I'm going, why do you have an iPad for school? Everything you're doing. And you literally have no ability to communicate. That's a basic skill to me. So that is why I just keep feeling like we keep putting screens before skills, and we need to put the skills before the screens. That's my big concern. I still can't get over that. But I think it's true. Now we have kids who not only don't know how to type, they don't know how to write either. Like their handwriting is atrocious, or they have no their fine motor. I talk a lot with occupational therapists and physical therapists, and they talk about how like they used to work on like handwriting skills. Now they're teaching children how to turn pages of a book. That children don't know how to manually turn the page of a book because they just don't interact with a book that much. What? So mind-boggling to me.
No, you still see it because you give a physical book to a student, you're like, right, let's look in the index or the contents. Like, sir, what's one of them? And they don't really understand what the concept is. And sometimes when you have a teacher approach you with a task and they say, right, they have to use a laptop or Chromebook or iPad for this lesson, you go, okay, I'm going to utilize it because this is what the task of the teacher says. We're going to try and look at it. And then you give it to the student and you say, right, I need you to research this task and we're going to build upon it. And then suddenly they turn around and go, so how do I research or what am I researching? And it's just about they're lacking the skills to problem solve and go, actually, this is the question in the title. So I need to try and pull some keywords out, or I need to do some reading about this. Or actually go, let's look at textbook first. And they're like, well, actually, why have I got to use a textbook when I can just use an iPad? Or then suddenly they got an iPad and they go, oh, look, sir, I produced this really good essay. I'm like, well, that essay's taking you 10 minutes. How did you use that? Oh, I've used AI, sir. I just
GPT.
And that's the next adjustment that we're moving to, is because it's become too easy for it. But when you talked about that friction earlier, a term that I loved that you used is frictionless technology. And that's what you talk about there, is less critical thinking. And that is what we're seeing because of the approach towards it, whereby we're not understanding, or individuals aren't understanding the critical skills behind it that is needed.
Yes, exactly. And that again, it's when we think about what children need, and too often we make decisions based on what we think adults would do or need. And I mean, I guess I should say technologists or decision makers in a district. But anyone who's worked with children knows that children's brains are not the same as adult brains. They don't process information the same way. They're not fully developed. They lack self-regulation and impulse control. That is all building until they're 25, even 30 years old. And so it's wrong to assume that what works for adults works for kids. And you can't assume that a child would, just because you say make a presentation, there are so many of those preschools that have to go into that I think that's absolutely critical. And unfortunately, by giving the tech, if Google is there, that is easier. It's funny that we talk about, people worry about AI as a source for more cheating. It's absolutely happening, but kids have been cheating forever. Like, that's not new. It just makes it even easier to do it. And the issue it's not even AI. I mean, kids are still just going to go to Google to get the answer, even if they have a digital platform that could provide it. If there's too much friction to get the information, they're going to go to the easiest one, because that's what our brain wants. Our brains seek the easiest out, or the easiest solution. And that doesn't mean you're going to learn. It's efficient, or it's quick, or convenient, but it's not learning. It's not deep learning, I should say. And that's worrisome to me, because it's so cliche. We're working with the future. These children are the future leaders, the decision makers, the politicians, the, thought leaders. If they can't think critically, that is a very big threat to our democratic institutions. I see a through line directly between children not getting that experience young and what our future looks like.
And I think it's taking that face value of things as well, whereby they're just looking at things when they're not actually processing it. And therefore, they're not looking at the detail or the structure of it and all the very important details which are critical towards what a situation may be, because they're looking at it going, yep, that's done, that presents this information. Actually, what does this line in the information actually analyze and tell you? Actually, it's the type of context, it's the type of information. So when I get to do tasks with students and they're looking at maybe a video on YouTube, I'm like, actually, hear where the music is here. Why is the music being put in at this point at this time? What are the actions representing? And then they're suddenly starting to think about what the video represents and the music and how this is all pieced together, rather than just taking it at face value. This is another YouTube video. And I think it's that important structure of there has to be an element of learning towards every time we utilize technology to piece towards the bigger pictures. And even if it's not our, subject matter expertise, we need to just touch upon it a little bit, just so we can link those theories and learning and
Right.
aspects together for that wider context towards learning,
Exactly.
which is critical.
Yes, exactly. I agree.
And even today, when I had a student in, they were in isolation. So she had isolation in the afternoon, and she came to me this morning just to clarify. And part of that was when they come to isolation, they have to give in their phones for the day. They don't have access to it. And so she handed over a phone. And I said, right, actually, your isolation's in the afternoon, so I'll see you at this time. And she went to me, right, so I'll have my phone back then, and I'll get it back to you when I see you this afternoon. I said, well, actually, I'll keep your phone because this way I guarantee, one, you'll come back to your isolation, and two, it'll mean you'll have a more successful day because you won't be on it. Oh, sir, what am I going to do at break time then? Well, actually, you can chat to your friends. No, sir, I need my phone to chat to my friends. Well, no, you don't need your phone to chat to your friends. You actually need
Yeah.
to go out and speak to them and get used to the
Right.
fact. And in the end, she actually left the phone and walked off. I was actually quite surprised she left it for the day, to be honest, considering
Yeah.
that she was in isolation in the morning. But it was that initial, I need the phone. And second of all, I need my phone to speak to my friends, because they weren't used to going out and having free time upon a break time to chat to their friends in a peer context of one-to-one communication or small groups, because
Exactly.
they're so used to texting or walking around with their friends and texting. So it's when you see groups and you see perhaps those out with family and they've taken pictures, they shared it on social media, and you see one of them with a headphone in. Now that is one of my biggest bugbears, because you're out with your kids, you're out with your family. They should not have their headphone in, because they're half concentrating to you, and it's also
Yeah.
showing, well, actually, I'm half interested in towards this, and I want to do my own thing at the same time. And I think there has to be an approach towards that and a conversation, because we should be overcoming what these areas are, especially if they're
Yes.
our own children and our own family, for
Yes.
example.
Yes, I agree. And one of the excuse me, one of the things I talk a lot about, and I work with a lot of parents, is like, look, this isn't your fault that things have gotten as bad as they have. I mean, people are, especially non-parents, are like, "Oh, just take it away, just say no." Well, if it were that easy, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation, right? There's obviously some huge obstacles to this. And I always say it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Yes, we have to hold tech companies accountable. Yes, we need to ask questions of our children's schools, but it also starts with us. How we use digital tech is how our children will use it, because it's watching how we do it determines how they do it. And yeah, you're right. A divided attention is probably one of the most heartbreaking things that parent can do to a child, right? Is to say, I'm only half here, I'm only half listening. Now, I'll get pushback on this. Oh, well, I'm working, or I've got a work call. Well, then you need to distinguish that that's what you're doing. And I call this living your life out loud, that you narrate what you do as you're doing. If you have to go out and you have to make a call when you're with your family, you say that. I'm stepping out. I have a phone call I need to make. Excuse me, I will be back in 5 minutes, right? Like, that way it's clear. And there's also has to be some accountability too. There has to be okay for a child to say to a parent, "Hey, I don't feel like you're listening to me." Respectfully to say it to a parent, and for a parent to be humble and say, "You're right. I'm sorry. I need to do better." And that's going to require some effort on a parent part too, right? And again, I want to make it really clear, I struggle with this as a parent. This is not easy. And I also know my kids are watching me. And so we have work to do. There's no question. And any family that wants to change their rules around screen time or change how their family works around screen time has to start with how the adults in the house use it. And that's a hard thing. Not a lot of parents are up for that.
I think that's such an important piece. But I also love that quote in terms of live your life out loud, because I think that is such an important way, just a piece, an approach towards something, and how that can come across in terms of that communication, that language, that relationship, and just utilizing some terms which might be very positive, friendly, and how that might overcome. The stress levels or arguments or the negative behaviors which might come across because you've asked your child or essentially an individual to do something, and it might go against what
Yes.
their norms are because they've seen the behaviors of others and gone, well, actually, they do it. So when I see it in my classroom, I'll see they're on a Chromebook. Well, yes, because they're on a Chromebook because they have a task. They're in a GCSE year, so they're an older year group. They
Yeah.
have a very important piece of work to do. You're actually a younger year group, so I'd like you to work on this in a different way. It doesn't necessarily mean
Yeah.
that you need the
Yes.
same resource as them. So I think that
Exactly.
relationship is critical to have that conversation.
Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I always say to families too, like, we're going for, 80% of the time parenting within our values, saying what we want to say. We're not going to do it perfectly all the time. And I think there's value in that as well as an adult to say, I don't know everything. I make mistakes too. The phone is addictive for me. It's hard for me to put it away. So, that kind of both normalizes the struggle and makes us a little bit more human to our children. And I think that's a very valuable, modeling is absolutely how children learn, right? About what it means to be a person in the world and interact with others. And to take that one step further, adults, how are you engaging in the comment threads on social media? What kinds of comments do you post? What kinds of things do you reshare, and post about? Like, eventually that's all going to be found by your children. Like, are you going to feel proud about that? Are you going to be able to stand behind your words and actions? And so it's sort of taking that longer view, but we've got work to do. It's hard. It matters.
And again, I think that's where it comes to modeling, and it fits in very nicely with a sort of different approach towards this. And that approach is actually, how do you go towards overcoming some of the barriers which maybe a family has come to you about? They said, look, Emily, our children are focusing too much on their screen time. Whenever we try to remove their devices at, say, dinner time, they're giving us some backlash and we're seeing a little bit of attitude and negative behaviors. Well, actually, you might use an approach of a strategy-based approach. You might use
Yep.
behavior-based concepts. You might go into a coaching perspective and how you might coach your children into doing something over a period of time. So rather than demanding off of them and then you have a big argument with them, you may take, say 6 weeks, for example, and that continuous coaching of repetition and that habit is going to be important over time. So if this family came to you and said, what approach would you advise? How would you go about reviewing the approach
Yeah.
towards modeling, maybe a strategy, and then how coaching fits into that?
Yeah, and I love the word coaching because even though I'm called the screen time consultant, in a lot of ways, of my role is, as certainly with parents, is more about the coaching part of it because I I don't do one-off sessions. I require 8 minimum, and that's because, as you know, this isn't going to change in one session. This requires repetition and little baby steps incrementally. So with families typically that come to work one-on-one, we start by sort of identifying the big problem areas. Maybe it's iPad time in the morning, maybe it's a child's video game time or personal phone, and we sort of figure out where those hot spots are. And then we start talking about the language around how we use digital tech in the house. So how often are we having conversations that are contentious, stressful, conflict ridden? Because that's immediately going to shut down any progress, right? The kids know we hate it. We approach it critically, they get defensive, and we're at a standstill, right? So I often will invite parents to sort of, I call it go backward to go forward, to back off the criticism and start by just noticing and observing and saying, I see you really like that YouTube channel. Tell me what it is you like about it. What is this person teaching you? How do you like how he does X, Y, or Z? The curiosity piece. I say, it's not my line, but I always talk about replacing judgment with curiosity. Because even if you hate YouTube or Roblox or Minecraft or whatever they're doing, and they know that you hate it, if you can start with the connection piece, expressing interest in their interest, whether you want that to be their interest or not, is not up to you ultimately. And so being curious and engaged with them is a huge part of the beginning part of the process working with families. We also talk a lot about values, family values. What is it that your family operates? What are the values that you operate under? And is everybody sort of living within those? If parents are having their phones at the dinner table, you can't think that kids aren't going to do it. If parents have phones in the bedroom at night, don't expect your teenager to turn in their phone at night. I mean, part of it is like, if you want that to be the thing, the very non-negotiable important piece of family rule or value, then everyone has to participate, and that's hard. That requires some changing, which is why I don't do it all at once, right? We baby step it. We do a little bit at a time, take a week or two to practice something new, how we're talking about it. Living your life out loud is another really big one that I really, right off the bat, encourage families to start with. It's free, it's easy. Don't have any special skill set. You just have to start narrating what you're doing anytime you reach for your phone. I'm checking the weather. I'm looking to see what time soccer practice is. I'm texting my friend to see when she's coming over. Constant stream of narration. Annoy your children. It's working when they roll their eyes.
And as I said to my friend the other day, consistency, insistency, and persistency. So when you have all three of these
Mm,
things, that is a great approach that you have to have, because if you're going to end up coaching in a way and you're using terminology, you have to be consistent with it. You have to be insistent that the individual does it. And then if you're
yes,
persistent in doing it, you're going to see the outcomes as a result of it. So these combination of these elements in a coaching capacity, I think, is very important. So you might have a
yes,
goal-based approach whereby the goal is to not have the phone at the table for dinner time. Actually, that's going to maybe take that 8 week period, which is going to come round to that. So it might be a case of reducing it bit by bit. It might be a case of where the phone isn't at that table. So there's a
yes,
great sort of clip by Simon Sinek, and I'm
yes,
sure you've seen it, where he talks about if the phone is on the table, then it's portraying that that is important than you because you're not fully
yes,
concentrated. And I think that's
exactly.
so very true. And I remember watching a film with a friend about 18 months ago, and they got their phone out and they started texting in the middle of it. And I paused the film and they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, you're not watching the film, you're texting." "I can do both." Well, actually, we're either watching a film or you're on your phone, in you. And no, you can't do both.
Good for
And
you.
for me, there was a level of rudeness within that, because it's just simply like, oh, actually, I'm going to get my phone now and I'm going to half concentrate on this. So therefore, we're not actually doing this together anymore. And I think that's so important in terms of
Yes,
that context and really piecing together what your values are and how that
yes.
instills the expectations within the room.
Yes, and that's a great example. And I think we have to be courageous in moments, especially with people we love or our friends or family, to say, like, I'm going to just wait until you're done because I can tell you're distracted. And actually, even with my child, sometimes, so she's uses an iPad to text with her friends, but she uses my phone number. So we essentially kind of share my phone, which has been a very interesting experience. And we're in a transition phase right now. But one of the things I will see, and she doesn't have it at school. So she comes home and she's catching up, she's posting and looking and seeing what her friends had did during the day. And I might start to talk to her and I can tell she's not listening, she's not hearing. And so I'll just stand there and I will say, I'm going to wait till you're finished texting and then I need your eyes so I know you're listening. And this isn't even necessarily tech based. This was a teaching strategy, right? Like it's like you can't communicate a message to someone who's not listening, who's not ready to receive it. And so that's true too on the parenting side. If your kid is coming up to you and you're texting and not really listening, it's okay to say, I hear that you're telling me something. I want to give you my full attention. Just let me finish writing this and I will put my phone down, right? Actually, it was my husband who said this, and I just thought this was so powerful. When we are texting someone who's not with us, like my kid's standing here and I'm on my phone, we're giving someone who's not even in the room permission to interrupt us when I'm standing with my child. And if that's what's happening, then we need to say that out loud. We need to live our lives out loud and own it. Just say, like, I know it feels like I'm not listening to you right now because I'm distracted by a message coming in. And then I'm going to put my phone down. It is much better than, as you say, to not try to multitask. I mean, multitasking is a myth. We know that, right? Like, you cannot do two deep focused activities simultaneously. What happens is we end up switching rapidly between them, which wears out our focus and makes that task take longer anyway. And so, I love to debunk that myth with especially kids who argue that they can do it. But I think that's actually a very powerful example of modeling that and saying, like, I'm choosing to do this with you, but if you want to choose your phone, then I'm not going to turn the video on, right? Like, that's great. And I say that to, families will say, oh, we do family movie night. And I say, oh, well, that's great. Is it one screen, one family? Because if it's mom and dad on their phones while the movie's playing, that's not a family movie night. You have to call it what it is. Everybody on their own screen night. Maybe that's fine, but that's not what a family movie night looks like. So I try to get that clarity around the language around that.
And I think it's true, because how your expectations have to be for that have to be critical in terms of what your outcomes want to be. So if you're going to say, right, our family movie night is going to take place once a week, this week we're going to have no phones, and then suddenly you start allow the phones to creep back in, you're going to get yourselves back into a negative routine, which you might not want to see.
Exactly.
What you tried to
Yeah.
work from coming out of, and then you're allowing the sort of negative and bad habits to take place and take precedence over what your values are, and therefore you start to adjust yourself towards the expectations of someone else, because that's their behaviors and that's their norm. So they're trying to get you to adjust the way that that they want you to perform, and it's actually,
Yeah.
no, it should be the other way around, because these are the expectations that you have in front of you.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly. And again, it's the modeling and it's the opportunity to say, I'm not perfect either. I make mistakes. This is hard for me to put this down. And, the other thing about living your life out loud is that you can also add in that emotional component. You can say, like, I was bored and I was standing in line at a coffee shop and I started looking at Instagram and I just feel bad about my life now. I feel like everybody's doing all these cool things and my life is boring, right? That is incredibly powerful for children to hear, that even adults experience this, that it is a difficult place to be. And so again, it's like I always think about, all I need is one negative comment or one critical thing on one of my posts, and I'm stuck on that. And I'm 46 years old. I think about a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old who has no context, no, like foresight and hindsight yet in their life. How on earth are they going to process that and not internalize it? Right? It's just, again, developmentally not what is right for children.
And I think it's about understanding what is right for children and when. So if I said to you, Emily, is there a framework around, whether we looked at the age bracket of 2 to 4 and then 5 to 8 and then,
Yeah.
9 to 12, for example, would you say there would be a sort of an example amount of time that they should have? So, if it's 2 to 4, it should be, maximum 1 hour a day. And then, for 8 to 12, it might be, 2 hours a day. Was there sort of a framework around this, or is it sort of a person to family approach understanding of this?
Yeah. Well, so my TLDR of my business is later is better, less is more, relationships first. And I get this question all the time because it does feel like if I just have a number, that will help me. For some families, that might be true. The World Health Organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they sort of give a time frame for 6 years and under, but they don't really specify above age 6, or they talk about co-viewing, limiting to educational content. There's a few challenges to answering this. One is that not all screen time is created equal, right? Like if I'm FaceTiming with my cousin, that's very different than if I'm scrolling through TikTok videos for an hour, right? And so, I would argue as a parent, I'd rather my kid be FaceTiming with their cousin for an hour than TikTok for an hour. So it's not a one-to-one exchange. The other problem is children aren't standardized. Some kids can handle an hour of screen time and then turn it off and be fine and go do other things. Other kids are so dysregulated or cannot handle that transition that it's not even worth doing an hour. The other thing, that I like to think about, the challenge with giving an age limit or a time is that it's not like it's a magic number. It's not like when a child turns 16, they can handle social media, right? We all know mature 16-year-olds and extremely immature ones, right? They're not the same. So rather than that question here, I invite parents to think about these two things instead. Rather than how much time and what parental controls, because those are the two questions I get the most. The questions I want parents to think about are, do I know what my child is doing online? Like, do I actually know what they are spending time with and in? And the second question is, do I have a good relationship with my child? There is research to back up that knowing the answers to those two questions is the protective factor for later mental health. And so, why is that? Because obviously, if there's a good relationship with your child, that child's coming to you and asking questions or saying, oh, I saw this thing that made me uncomfortable. What do I do? That's what we want, by the way. And it's less about you hit 2 hours, turn it off, and I have no idea what you've been doing for 2 hours, right? So I would much rather parents really do that investigative curiosity, and I know right away when parents use the word roadblocks instead of roadblocks that they have no idea what Roblox is. And it's also not one game, it's thousands of games. And it's also where creepy people hang out and try to contact children. So then you're like, if you don't know those basic things, your kid probably is doing stuff you don't know about online. And again, I really stress this. It is not because children are seeking it out. More often than not, it is accidental. They got tricked somehow. They stumbled into something. It's like a Google search gone wrong, where you accidentally mistype or you write something that's misinterpreted. So we have to be prepared to have those conversations. And it's not a question of if they see pornography or violence, it's when. And so that has to be a conversation from, I'm not kidding, age 4 on, that we are talking to our kids about, there is stuff on here that's not for kids. The first thing you need to do if that ever comes up is to let me know. I'll never be mad at you. Thank you for telling me. That has to be on repeat all the time throughout childhood if our kids interacting on the internet.
And I think that perspective and that question in terms of the way that you've portrayed those other two questions is really important to open up that learning, because someone might go, especially as an educator, well, actually, we need to have this framework in place. Actually, a framework doesn't always fit all. And when I sit down in conferences and training things, I'm like, another framework. This doesn't actually always have to be the way. Sometimes we need more of a descriptive framework whereby we have chosen options out of this and how this might portray throughout, so we can adapt it and adjust rather than this is a time frame, this is this, and this is that. And I think these are such important concepts about how they are really important. But I think in terms of that relationship, as you say, for when they access that time and what they're accessing, and even that type of search, because one of the podcast episodes that I was listening to, you alluded to the Harry Potter story with your son, if I was correct. And I thought that was such a great and easy and such a innocent sort of search into things, which is really nice to have, because there is that innocence there. And I had it yesterday with a student, and some of the other students were talking about drinking, and this younger student was like, what's drinking, what is this? And I was like, there is such a nice feel of innocence there, because he doesn't truly understand what it is, and therefore he's still exploring the world, and he's being brought up in a way where he's protected from these things, which is good, but he will find out at the right time when the right moment hits for him. And I was like, and I had to have a really good discussion with the older students about that, and they actually agreed actually he should still have his innocence and it shouldn't be taken away from him. So that Harry Potter story really resonated with me because of yesterday's event. So it is that innocence which comes and plays in, and that individuality towards what exposure might be in a natural way.
Yes. And again, that's where we get mixed up with what's developmentally normal and how does the internet and technology interfere or conflict with that. Because curiosity is normal. Children are curious. That is how they learn about the world, right? And we want that. We don't want to stop that. But if they're curious about something, where do they go for information now? It's the internet or social media. And so again, if this is really pushing parents to have conversations probably before they're ready or want to about things that are topics that seem really big and heavy. But I mean, I would rather have that before my child sees it than have my child stumble into something and not understand it. And it's powerful to hear the older children say that too, that they recognize that there's a desire to preserve that innocence. I think that's really powerful. And I do think young people, Gen Z, I'm sort of, my children are about Gen Z, and I just feel a lot of hope for the future because they've grown up with a lot of technology. And I think some of them are like, this isn't good for us. Like, we know. And so that's the other thing, is like the other piece of this that's developmentally normal is kids don't want adults to make rules, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's normal for a child to be like, I don't like that there's this rule about this. I don't like that you're putting a limit. I don't like that you said no. Well, but in what other generation have we been like, okay, then I won't set a rule. I won't set a limit. That's not healthy. Kids need boundaries. And you mentioned something a few minutes ago I wanted to come back to, which is there is some research, and Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, writes about, he talks a lot about this research, which is if you ask a group of kids, like, would you give up Instagram? How much could I pay you to give up Instagram? It's like, $50, $100. But if you say to that kid, what if I got everyone else to give up Instagram? How much would I have to pay you? And they said, we'd pay you. So it's this collective action problem, right? It's not just me giving it up. It has to be everyone, because if I don't give it up, or if I give it up and no one else does, I'm missing out, right? It is true, whether we like it or not. That is where older teenagers are hanging out and making social plans. And so, yet they also recognize that they don't want it, that it's not necessarily good for them or part of the existence that they like. And so that's where adults need to come in. And I do think it's okay for kids to be like, I hate this. This is stupid. You're mean. You're the worst parent in the world. I mean, welcome to the club. It's a big membership.
Absolutely, yeah, it certainly is. And when you say about, or when about the rules, and when we haven't seen it before, it's always been done in terms of that rule breaking. We're never going to like the
Yeah,
constraints that are put upon us. So there is those elements which are really of key considerations when it comes down to certainly parents, and how even educators might put in a concept, or these rules or boundaries, and how they
yes,
then have they want children to conform to that. Well, actually, your expectations will be key to that, because as soon as you have expectations, the moment they break a rule, they might feel a bit of morality within that. They might look at the values. They might actually feel something towards that, which is greater than the rules at the time. So it's actually
yeah,
how these perspectives come into importance, because you talked about this again in terms of not favoring parental control over that. And
hmm,
sometimes someone might listen to that and go, actually, how can you not have parental control? Actually, there's a perspective on that, because you're looking at the educational perspective of what could be a real tool towards approaching a healthy relationship of something which is going to be so key in the future for the Gen Z, for the future generations which are coming in front of us, which perhaps one day they might govern us as we get older.
yes, exactly. And again, I always say, like, if you have parental controls and they work for your family, fine. But the number of people who ask me what they should use, who see it as an exemption from the parenting and the mentoring and the teaching, is pretty high. And so we think it's this, silver bullet that's going to fix all of our problems. Having parental controls does not stop your child from asking for more screen time. Let's be clear. It just changes the nature of it. It's also using technology to solve a problem that technology created, and if they worked, I wouldn't be asked that question all the time, right? This is the other thing, is how much burden it puts on parents to address this. And that much rather, instead of you spending hours online trying to learn these controls and lock everything down, I'd rather you spend that in investing in the relationship with your child, because the chances are your kid is savvier than you. That's what we were. We were always savvier than our parents, right? They're going to Google it and figure out how to undo it anyway. So how many times have I heard that? All the time. And so, again, some families find that that works. Great. That is not the majority of what I hear, and it is not often a success story. So I just say that with a caveat, it cannot be the only piece of the puzzle.
And that is so true. And I think that puzzle is really important for us, really to build and really to concentrate on how we want that to look, how it is going to look for maybe someone else. And then these pieces are going to come together in terms of how that education, that coaching, that relationship, the dialogue that we use, how we start to reduce the screen time which we're seeing. And then we start to look at those other areas, as you talked about, in terms of pornography, which is very critical towards a young person, and how that behavior then links back into that, and how it is then
Yeah.
going to shape their minds and behavior towards others outside of what their behavior is behind the screen. So what they might see behind the screen might be very normal, and then when they go out into the real world, their behaviors are
Yes.
actually very strange and very odd, and they're not seen as socially acceptable. Now, again, other people might argue, actually, what are social acceptable norms? Well, actually, there is actually ones that we need, and
Yeah.
by standards that govern us, but is also a way of living which has to be acceptable, whereby we have to conform with other people, whereby we have to develop relationships. We have to understand when it's okay to say something and when it's not, when our behaviors might be off-putting, and all these other intricacies which come within that,
Yes.
which are really important.
Yes, I agree. And those again are all skills that children need to be taught, no matter where they are on the behavioral continuum. Some kids pick it up quickly, and others need to be overtly taught. When you're in public, you don't do this, or when you're in public, you do this. Those are the social norms matter deeply. And you're right. I mean, I have heard horrible stories about kids acting out things that they see in pornography. Like children, they have no conception of what that actually means or looks like, but that's what they saw. And we can't assume that they're not seeing stuff. Whether and porn is certainly extreme, but there's other behavioral things kids pick up online, pranks or jokes, stuff that tricks into that, like, meanness and cruelty that are deeply problematic. If they see it and it's normalized, then that's what they're going to do in real life. And so again, we as much as we can be a counter message to what the consumption of what's happening online, while we also minimize their access to it, the better. And I'm under no, I'm not a fool. I know that even with the best intentions and good parenting and saying no and setting limits, kids are still getting it. It's whether it's school friends' devices or school computers or a burner phone. So it's again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, because even some small changes and actions matter. It's we can't just throw our hands up and say, "Ugh, it's too much, I can't deal with it." It matters.
What a great quote, and again, a great way that you piece that together, which is really important in terms of that approach that comes towards it and that understanding, which does really fit in. And there is one sort of question that I have, because we have covered so
Yeah.
much in this conversation, and you've really pieced it together in such a great way, where we've related learning back to each topic that we've sort of come up naturally, and it's built towards a nice perspective and different arguments for those listening, and how they may take that approach towards coaching their relationships, their
Yeah.
dialogue which they may use, how they might go and look at some papers, and how they may go away, how they may go and check out your blogs, which are a real great read, by the way, and whether they check out your book
Thank
as
you.
well, and your other podcast episodes, because they are truly great how they've all come across. And even some of the blogs which I've read, I've actually read them and I've gone, actually, that's a very different perspective. So when you talk about those AI, for example, and I think when you talk about sharing your phone with your 12-year-old daughter, I thought that was such an interesting and different way of approaching life,
Yeah.
whereby it is so different in terms of that thinking outside the box, or well, to actually come over that phrase, which is far too used sometimes, but to think differently, and how someone might
Yeah.
not see that as a social norm actually is a
Yeah.
very healthy relationship with your 12-year-old, for example, and having openness and transparency, which other parents and carers and family members may not have with their children and young people.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And what I try to bring to this work is information and education, but also like a sense of empathy and understanding that this is hard and I'm working on it too. That this is, if I can try some things and share what worked and didn't work with other people so that they can learn, that's great. I mean, I think there's a lot of, I called my book The Screen Time Solution, because I think there's a lot of books out there that are all about the problem. And I wanted parents to feel like there was some hope and that they have some agency in making change. Again, even small changes matter. And it's sort of like one family, one person, one parent at a time. That the pendulum, again, to use a cliche, it is swinging. I do feel a lot of optimism for where things are headed. And so, don't give up. Keep fighting.
For sure. But if I had to ask you, what would be your top three tech intentional tips?
Mm. Well, number one is live your life out loud. Absolutely. I think that we talked about that. There's such benefit to it. The other one is be the role model, right? Like, don't just expect your children to change. And then, just from a really practical standpoint, there are things that you can do as an adult to decrease your scrolling. So I think about my tech intentional tips, like turn your phone to grayscale, turn off all your notifications, get an alarm clock. I mean, I always joke that I should take money from the alarm clock industry given how much time I talk about alarm clocks, but 95% of us use a phone as an alarm. Well, that means our kids are going to do it too. If it's a simple matter of you need to be waking up in the morning, old school alarm clocks still work. They're annoying, but they don't have Twitter on them, right? Like they're just a sound that goes off when we need it. So, again, those are sort of my top three, but I've got lots more, as you said, on my blog and my newsletters and stuff. So
Yes, and not to give them all away, but if you actually check out Emily's YouTube, there is a wide array of videos to go with that as well. So the great thing is, literally, as you type your name into Google, I know that we've been talking about overcoming some of the Google searches, but
yes.
type your name in, you will appear with your own website where you can check out the blog and other services that you offer, and other testimonials, which is great. And you do appear then on other podcasts. You then come up across LinkedIn, and I did listen to when you sat in front of the
Oh
American,
yeah.
I can't remember the term for when you presented a couple of weeks ago to the
Oh,
American
the
Council.
Vermont State House.
Yes,
Yes,
that was
yes.
it. I remember watching that, and I thought that was quite an interesting take. So you're in so many
Thank
different places, and I think it's so important to listen to you. So
thank you.
definitely check Emily out, because her work is truly amazing. But again, Emily, I really appreciate your time, your flexibility as well. And I think it's been great to cover this topic. And I know we said about sport, but the perspective of sport will sit in terms of minds and how you approach the information from this. But I think it's been such an important topic because as we talk about skills and even touching upon, development of resilience, individuality, personality, the relationships, and all the other areas that we've discussed throughout, and maybe, will be that critical thinking as someone listens to this, they can unearth a little bit more in terms of how they take that away and build upon that by accessing your resources. It's been such a great podcast episode, and I appreciate your time because as I watch more and listen to you, I couldn't wait to chat to you.
Wonderful. I appreciate that you did that ahead of time too. It's nice to come into something where you have a sense of what I've already said and done. So thank you for having me and including me in this. It's really wonderful to hear about your experiences as well. And thank you for being a teacher. It's so important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And you still got the rest of your day to go. So I hope you have a great rest of the day and take care. But a big thank you from me again.
You're welcome. Thank you again, Luca.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Emily. And you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
But yeah, we try to be that group that can help be there for the players as a three, because I think you mentioned earlier, you want to have different characters in the changing room. You want to have different personalities. You don't want the same kind of people because you're not going to be able to move forward. If you've got 10 people and they all agree the same things, you're going to get to a point in time where actually you're going to become unstuck. You need that one person to actually be like, nah, I don't agree with that. Or actually, we should try this. And I think that's why the huddle works, is we're all quite different as human beings. And I think you need 3 different people in there because some players will naturally gravitate towards me and my personality, but equally some might go to the other 2, and that's absolutely fine.